My name is Graham Whitfield, and 3 years ago my younger brother took everything I had spent 38 years building. The sheep station in Marlborough that I'd bought with a bank loan and a prayer when I was 24. The civil engineering firm I'd grown from a two-man outfit in a rented shed in Blenheim to a company with 63 staff across the South Island. My border collie, Archie, who'd slept at the foot of my bed for 11 years. And my 2 grandchildren's weekly Sunday dinners, which my daughter-in-law quietly canceled the month after the court ruling came through. My brother left me one message after the settlement was finalized. I still remember every word of it. You always acted like Dad loved you more, Graham. Now we're even. At 62 years old, I went from owning one of the largest privately held civil engineering firms in Marlborough to stacking shelves 3 nights a week at a Pack and Save in Richmond. From sleeping in the homestead my wife and I had renovated over 20 years to renting a single bedroom in a shared flat with 2 university students who left their dishes in the sink for days at a time. From being called Granddad every Sunday morning to reading about my grandchildren's school events on Facebook because nobody thought to ring me anymore. But here is what I have learned about losing everything at an age when most men are thinking about retirement. Rock bottom has a strange kind of silence to it. And sometimes, in that silence, you finally hear things that were always there, waiting for you to go quiet enough to listen. It started with a lawnmower, not a grand discovery in a corporate tower, not a mysterious stranger in an expensive suit, just an old Massport mower that had been sitting in my landlord's shed for 2 years, and a retired accountant next door named Beverly who needed her lawns done before her daughter visited from Christchurch. What happened because of that lawnmower, and because of what Beverly knew about my family, did not just change my financial situation, it revealed that my father had been carrying a secret for 31 years, and that the man I had blamed for abandoning our family had never abandoned us at all. I need to go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. I built Whitfield Civil from nothing. When I was 24, fresh out of an apprenticeship with a Christchurch roading firm, I borrowed $45,000 from the BNZ and bought a second-hand excavator with a cracked cab window and a hydraulic arm that needed new seals every 8 months. My mother watched me drive it off the yard in Nelson and said, very quietly, that she hoped I knew what I was doing. My father was not there. He had not been there for anything since I was 31 years old. According to my mother, he had simply walked out. One Thursday, in late autumn, 1993, he drove his ute out of the driveway of our family home in Havelock and never came back. No note, no phone call, no explanation. My brother Neville was 26 at the time. I was 31. Our sister Patricia was 28. My mother said he had been struggling. She said there had been money problems she had not fully understood, and that she believed he had been too proud to ask for help. She cried every time I brought it up. So eventually, I stopped asking. Neville never stopped being angry about it. Not for one day in the 31 years that followed. Every family dinner, every Christmas, every milestone. Our father's absence was a wound he kept pressing. He told our mother she was too forgiving. He told me I was too indifferent. He said I acted as though it had not affected me because I had always been the favorite, because Dad had always been prouder of me than of him, and that I had not really lost anything when Dad left, because I had never needed him the way Neville did. I did not know how to respond to that then. I am not sure I do now. What I do know is that Neville spent 30 years turning his grief into something that looked a great deal like resentment. And eventually, that resentment needed somewhere to go. My wife Helen and I married when I was 29, 4 years before my father disappeared. She was a teacher from Picton, patient and steady in a way that balanced out my tendency to take on more than I could comfortably carry. We had one son, Daniel, who grew up watching me work long hours and still managed to grow into a decent man with a good marriage and 2 children of his own, Rosie and Tom. Whitfield Civil grew steadily through the 90s and into the 2000s. We specialized in rural infrastructure. farm laneways, irrigation systems, bridges across the kind of waterways that the bigger Wellington firms did not want to bother with. The work suited me. I liked being out on the land. I liked solving problems that had specific, physical solutions. By the time I turned 58, the firm was turning over $8 million a year. We had offices in Blenheim, Nelson, and a small satellite presence in Greymouth. I had 22 vehicles on the road and relationships with farming families going back 3 generations. Helen passed away in 2019 from a brain aneurysm. She was 61 years old. She was fine on a Tuesday and gone by the Thursday. There is nothing I can say about that which would be adequate. So I will only say that losing her made me less careful about the things I should have been watching more closely. Neville had worked in the firm's administration for 11 years by that point. After Helen died, I leaned on him more. I gave him signing authority over accounts I should have kept closer to myself. I was grieving and I was tired. And he was my brother. And I thought that had to count for something. I was wrong about that. The full picture only emerged in court. And even then, my solicitor said she had rarely seen paperwork assembled so methodically over such a long period. Neville had spent 4 years quietly shifting client relationships into a separate entity he had registered without my knowledge. He had renegotiated 3 of our largest contracts, introducing a clause that tied those clients to him personally rather than to Whitfield Civil. He had borrowed against company assets using a power of attorney that I had signed during a difficult week in 2020, when I had barely been sleeping and should not have been signing anything at all. The firm that I had built over 38 years was, by the time I understood what had happened, largely insolvent. The assets that remained were tied up in legal disputes that my solicitor told me would take years and considerable money to untangle. The homestead had to go. It was collateral for borrowings I had not known existed. Archie went to live with Daniel and his family. My daughter-in-law, Sandra, was kind about it. But I could see that she did not know what to do with a 62-year-old father-in-law who had lost everything to his own brother. I think she worried about how much of my time Daniel would feel obligated to give me, and I cannot say I entirely blamed her for that calculation, even if it stung. I found the flat in Richmond through a community Facebook group. 2 students, a shared bathroom, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of 2-minute noodles. I paid my third of the power bill and tried not to use the hot water at peak times. The Pack and Save job came through a conversation in the car park. A manager named Terry was putting groceries in his boot, and I got talking to him. I did not tell him I had once run a firm with 63 employees. I told him I was looking for something part-time and reliable. He gave me a trial shift and I showed up on time and did what I was asked, and that was enough. 3 nights a week, I stacked shelves and thought about what I should have seen coming. 2 months into this arrangement, I offered to mow my landlord's lawns to reduce my rent slightly. My landlord, a quiet man named Phil who worked nights at the hospital, said that would be fine, and pointed me toward a shed out the back. The shed was full of the particular type of accumulation that happens when a person inherits a house from a parent and cannot quite bring themselves to clear it out. Garden tools, old paint tins, a box of National Geographic magazines from the 1980s, and one reasonably functional Massport mower with a fuel line that needed a clean. I got the mower going and did Phil's lawns, and then, because I was out there anyway and the afternoon was fine, I did the strip along the footpath as well. The woman next door came out to check her letterbox and stopped when she saw me. "Are you Phil's father?" she asked. I explained that I was his tenant. She introduced herself as Beverly Stanhope. She was perhaps 75, with white hair cut short, and the kind of practical manner that suggested she had spent her working life dealing with numbers. She asked if I would consider doing her lawns as well, and named a figure that was more than fair. I did her lawns the following Saturday morning. She brought out a cup of tea afterward and we sat on her back porch, and she asked how I came to be renting a room in Richmond at my age, and something about her directness made me tell her most of the truth. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people realize. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "You said your surname is Whitfield. From Havelock originally? My family was—" "Yes. And your father's name?" "Warren. Warren Whitfield." Beverly set her mug down on the arm of her chair with a precision that seemed deliberate. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not immediately read. "I think," she said carefully, "that there is something you ought to know. But I want to be certain before I say anything. Would you be able to come back on Monday? I have some papers inside I would like to find over the weekend." I almost dismissed it. I almost said something polite and changed the subject. Because I was 62 years old, and I had been surprised enough for one lifetime, and I did not think I had the capacity for another complicated revelation. But something in the way she had set down that mug made me say yes. I did not sleep well that weekend. Monday came, and I knocked on Beverly's door at 10 in the morning as she had suggested. She led me through a neat hallway into a sitting room lined with bookshelves and a small desk in the corner that still had a proper wooden in-tray on it, the kind that offices stopped using in the 90s. She had a folder on the coffee table. She had also, I noticed, made a pot of tea and set out 2 cups, which told me she had been thinking about this as much as I had. "I was an accountant," she said, sitting down across from me. 34 years in practice, the last 18 as a partner in a small firm in Nelson. We handled a range of clients, personal and commercial. She opened the folder. "Your father was one of ours. Warren Whitfield. He came to us in 1994, the year after he left your family." My hands were very still in my lap. "He did not come to us straight away," she continued. "He came because he had been referred by a solicitor in Nelson, a man named Keith Drummond, who handled his situation when things became complicated." She paused. "Are you all right to continue?" "Please," I said. She told me what she knew. My father had not walked out because he was too proud to ask for help, or because he no longer loved his family, or because of any of the stories that had settled into the gaps over 31 years of silence. He had left because he had been given no other option. In 1992, my father had been a partner in a small earth-moving and contracting business based in Blenheim, a business he had built with a man named Douglas Farrell. They had been friends for 15 years before they went into business together. The partnership had been profitable for several years. And then in late 1991, an audit had uncovered serious financial irregularities. Funds moved through the company accounts into a separate entity that had been established without my father's knowledge. Douglas Farrell had been stealing from the business for 3 years. The theft was significant, nearly $200,000 at a time, when that was a great deal of money for a small contracting firm. But what happened next was what had driven my father out of the Marlborough Sounds and into a silence that lasted 3 decades. Douglas Farrell's brother-in-law was a detective sergeant with the Nelson Police. In the weeks after the audit findings, before my father had been able to engage a solicitor or lodge a complaint, a file appeared at the Blenheim police station suggesting that it was my father, not Douglas, who had been systematically misappropriating funds. Witness statements had been gathered. A paper trail had been constructed with a patience and deliberateness that suggested planning rather than improvisation. My father was arrested and held for 2 days. He was released without charge, but the damage to his reputation in a community the size of Marlborough was comprehensive and immediate. Clients withdrew. His bank called in a short-term loan. The partnership dissolved under circumstances that left him with nothing but legal bills and a name that people in the local contracting industry associated with fraud. He engaged Keith Drummond, who told him plainly that fighting a case in which the opposing witnesses included a serving police officer in a town where everyone knew everyone would likely cost him everything he had and destroy any future he could build for his family. Drummond told him that the man most likely to survive what Douglas Farrell had set in motion was a man who was no longer present to be targeted. So my father had left. Not because he did not love us, because he had been told by someone he trusted, that staying would make things worse for the people he was trying to protect. He had moved to Nelson under a variation of his own name, James Warren rather than Warren Whitfield, and had begun again from nothing. He had worked in construction, then started a small landscaping business, then expanded it gradually over 20 years into a company that handled commercial grounds, maintenance contracts across the top of the South Island. Beverly had managed his accounts for the last 18 years of his working life. She knew what the business had been worth because she had helped him structure it carefully, over many years, with a particular purpose in mind. He talked about his children often, she said. He hired investigators twice, in 2001 and again in 2008, to find out how your lives were going. He knew about your firm. He knew about your brother's work with you. He knew about your son Daniel and his children. She looked at me steadily. He never made contact because Keith Drummond had told him that Douglas Farrell still had connections in Marlborough, and that any surfacing on your father's part could reignite the original accusations. The last thing he wanted was to hand someone a reason to come after you. When did he die? I asked. My voice was level in a way that surprised me. 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. He went quite quickly, which was perhaps a mercy. She turned to a page near the back of the folder. He spent the last 2 years of his life working with his solicitor to ensure that his estate was structured in a way that would survive any challenge. He had no other beneficiaries. His entire estate, including the grounds, maintenance, business, and its contracts, 2 commercial properties in Nelson, and a managed investment portfolio, came to just over $4 million. I did not say anything for what felt like a long time. He left a letter, Beverly said. His solicitor has been waiting for the right moment to make contact. When I rang him Saturday morning and told him I believed I had found you, he said he had been expecting the call for over a year. My father's solicitor was a composed man in his 60s named Philip Tanaka, whose office occupied the second floor of a converted villa in Nelson. He met me the following morning and said, before anything else, that my father had spoken of me with a consistent and specific pride that had not wavered across 18 years of occasional conversation. He said you had his way of attacking a problem, Philip told me, quietly, from the sides, until you had it surrounded. He gave me the letter before anything else. I have read it perhaps 40 times since. I will not reproduce all of it here, but I will tell you what it contained, because it matters. My father wrote that leaving was the hardest decision he had ever made, and the one he had been least certain was right. He wrote that he had chosen to believe Keith Drummond's advice because he was frightened and because he loved us, and that he had spent every year afterward wondering whether a braver man would have stayed and fought, regardless of the consequences. He wrote that watching me build a firm in the same industry he had worked in the same part of the country, had given him more quiet pride than he had known how to carry. He wrote that he had sent money anonymously to my mother through a charitable trust in 2001, 2006, and 2011, when he knew from his investigators that she was struggling. He asked me to tell her, if I thought it would bring more comfort than pain, that he had never stopped thinking about her. He wrote that he was leaving everything to me, and that I was to use it as I saw fit. He asked only one thing. Not that I forgive him. He said he was not sure he had earned that and did not want to demand it. He asked only that I consider the possibility that a person can love someone completely and still make a choice that looks, from the outside, like abandonment. He signed it. Your father, Warren, who was always watching, even when you couldn't see him. I sat in Philip Tanaka's office for a long time after I finished reading. Philip brought me a glass of water and did not try to fill the silence, which I appreciated more than I could express. The estate was as Beverly had described. $4 million and some change, when the properties in the portfolio were fully valued. The grounds maintenance business, which traded under the name Summit Greenscapes, had 12 staff and annual contracts worth just over $1 million a year. Philip told me that the operations manager, a capable woman named Arohangata, had been running the day-to-day since my father's health had declined, and that she was prepared to continue doing so if I wished. He told me one more thing, and it was the detail that undid whatever composure I had managed to hold on to through the rest of the meeting. My father had a border collie, an older dog, 9 years old, black and white, who had been staying with Beverly since my father went into hospital. Beverly had not been sure what to do with him, and so she had simply kept him. His name was Moss. I drove back to Beverly's house that afternoon. She opened the door before I knocked, because she had seen my car. Moss was at her heel, and when I crouched down in her doorway, he came forward and pressed his nose against my hand with a directness that border collies have, as though they are checking whether you are worth the investment of their attention. I sat on Beverly's back porch for the second time and told her what Philip had said. She already knew most of it. She had been part of it, in her careful accountant's way, for many years. "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" I asked. "You must have known who I was when things went wrong with my brother. It was in the paper." She was quiet for a moment. "Philip told me not to approach you directly. He said your father had been clear that the inheritance should come through the proper legal channels, not through a neighbor's conversation. He was worried about challenges to the estate." She paused. "But when you showed up in Phil's garden with that mower, I thought perhaps your father's patience was working through other means." He was always very patient. Over the months that followed, I came to understand what had been left to me. Not just financially, but in terms of the shape of a life I had not known was being held in reserve. I did not sell Summit Greenscapes. Arohangata was running it well, with exactly the kind of quiet competence that does not need a new owner arriving with grand plans. I kept her on, gave her a meaningful pay increase, and shifted my own role to one where I was available for decisions but not inserting myself into operations that did not need me. She had her own ideas about how to grow the business, and her ideas were good, so I mostly asked questions and got out of the way. The civil engineering knowledge I had spent 38 years accumulating did not vanish because the firm did. I consulted on 3 contracts in the first year. Work that came through a former colleague in Blenheim who had stayed in touch through the mess with Neville. The fees were modest, but the work was satisfying. And it reminded me that what I knew had value separate from any company name. Daniel and I had a long conversation about 6 months after I claimed the inheritance. I drove to Motueka on a Sunday, and we walked along the estuary while Rosie and Tom raced each other along the track ahead of us. And Archie and Moss circled each other with the wariness of 2 dogs who have both been through a difficult time and are not yet sure about new company. "I didn't know how to help you, Dad," Daniel said. "When it all went wrong with Uncle Neville, I didn't know what you needed, and Sandra was worried, and I dropped the ball." "You didn't drop anything," I told him. "I was hard to reach. I went somewhere inside myself for a while. I should have come and found you there. You're here now," I said. "That's what matters to me. We have Sunday dinners again. Not every week, because Rosie has swimming on some Sundays and Tom has his football, and life at that age is correctly full of things that should take priority over visits to a grandparent. But often enough that I know the rhythm of their weeks. That Tom is struggling with long division and finds it easier if you use money as an example. That Rosie is reading above her age and prefers books where the main character makes at least one serious mistake before getting things right. I bought a small house in Wakefield, a 20-minute drive from Daniel's place and 10 minutes from Beverly, whom I have continued to have tea with most Saturdays. It is a plain house with a good-sized section that needed work when I bought it, which suited me. There is room in the spare bedroom for Rosie and Tom when they stay over, and a proper dog door for Moss and Archie, who have settled into a companionable arrangement in which Moss defers to Archie on questions of sleeping location, and Archie defers to Moss on everything else. I told my mother about my father 6 weeks after I met with Philip. I drove to Havelock and we sat in her kitchen, the one she has lived in for 50 years, with the same bench tiles she chose in 1974, and I told her as gently as I could what Beverly and Philip had told me. I told her about Douglas Farrell and Keith Drummond's advice, and the anonymous trust payments in 2001 and 2006 and 2011. She cried for a long time, not the brittle, defensive crying I had expected, but something deeper and older, as though something that had been locked up for 31 years was finally being allowed out. I always thought he'd lost his nerve, she said eventually. I thought he looked at everything we owed and everything that had gone wrong and he just couldn't face it. He faced it differently than you needed him to, I said. But he didn't stop. The money in 2006, she said. That was the year I nearly lost the house. I thought it was an error. I thought some trust had muddled their records, and I kept expecting someone to ring and ask for it back. Nobody was ever going to ask for it back. She held the letter for a long time without reading it. Then she asked if she could keep it, and I told her it had been written for both of us, and she could have it as long as she was willing to let me read it whenever I needed to. I have not spoken to Neville since the settlement. His solicitor contacted Philip Tanaka shortly after news of the inheritance became known in the way that news does in small New Zealand communities, and suggested a meeting to discuss a potential claim on my father's estate on the basis that Neville was also a son and had not been included. Philip consulted a barrister who confirmed that the estate had been structured precisely to withstand such a challenge, and that my father had left written documentation of his reasons for excluding Neville that would be difficult to argue against in court. The claim was withdrawn. I do not carry a great deal of feeling toward my brother. Not the burning kind of anger that would mean he was taking up space in my days. What I feel is closer to a tired kind of sorrow. For the 31 years, he spent feeding a story about being the one who was loved less, until the story became the only thing he had room for. I think about Douglas Farrell sometimes, about what it costs a person to spend that much careful energy on destruction. I never pursued a civil case against Neville, partly because my solicitor told me that what was recoverable would likely be consumed by the process of recovering it, but mostly because I have reached an age where I would rather spend my available attention on things that are still living. Once a fortnight, I do the lawns for 3 elderly residents on my street, the ones whose properties have been getting shaggy since their children moved to Auckland and their own knees became unreliable. I do not charge them. I enjoy being outside with a mower, and I find that doing something physical and useful in the afternoon clears the kind of thinking that otherwise goes in circles. Last month, I drove past a house in Wakefield with a skip bin outside, and a man my son's age sitting on the front step looking at paperwork with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that isn't coming out in his favor. I stopped and asked if he was all right. He was a builder who had bought the property to renovate and had hit unexpected costs in the foundations. I did not offer him money. I told him what I knew about structural costs in the area, gave him the name of a quantity surveyor I trusted, and said if he wanted to talk through his options over a cup of tea, he knew where I lived. He came on a Thursday evening. We talked for 2 hours. I don't know what he will do with the house, but he left looking as though the problem was at least a manageable size. I still have the folder Beverly put together. I keep it in the top drawer of my desk. Not because I need to check the numbers, but because sometimes, when the day has been long or the world has been noisy, I open it and look at my father's handwriting on the envelope and remember that patience can be a form of love even when it is indistinguishable from absence. My son Daniel asked me recently what I would say to my father if I had been able to meet him. I thought about it for a while, honestly, because I wanted to give him an answer that was true rather than one that simply sounded right. I think I would tell him that I understand why he made the choice he made, I said, and that understanding it doesn't mean it didn't hurt, and that both of those things can be true at once. Daniel nodded. He is a thoughtful man. He sat with that for a moment, and then said, I think that's the most adult thing I've ever heard you say, Dad. I'm 63 years old. It takes some of us longer than others to get there. Moss is asleep on the mat by the back door as I write this. My grandchildren will be here on Sunday. I have enough in the freezer to make the kind of substantial roast that a 9-year-old doing swimming and a 7-year-old doing football will consume without leaving much for anyone else, and I have already decided that I do not mind. The grounds maintenance business is doing well under Aroha's management. She hired 2 new staff in the spring and has been talking about a contract with the Tasman District Council that would represent a significant step up. I told her to pursue it, that I would back her in whatever resourcing she needed, and that the decisions were hers to make. She thanked me, and then made the decisions without waiting for me to second-guess them, which is exactly the right approach. There are things I know now that I wish I had known at 40, or even 50. A legal agreement signed in a moment of grief or exhaustion can have consequences that outlast both the grief and the exhaustion. Read what you sign, even when you trust the person handing you the pen, especially when you trust them. The difference between a person who loves you and a person who is good for you is not always clear when you are inside the relationship. Sometimes it takes losing everything to see the shape of what you had. Resentment is a story we tell ourselves when grief feels too vulnerable. The story can become more real to us than the original wound, until we no longer know the difference. And the last thing, which I believe to be the most important, a person can do something that looks like abandonment and be doing something that looks like love from where they are standing. This does not mean every absence is justified. It does not mean you are required to forgive anything that comes with an explanation. But it means that before you close the door on the story of someone who hurt you, it is worth asking whether you have the whole story or only the part that reached you. My father built something for 31 years in silence, with his name changed and his address unknown, for a son he was not allowed to contact. He mowed the lawns of strangers and got up early and went to bed late and reinvested every dollar he could spare, because he could not be a father to me in any way that people would recognize, but he could be one in the only way the circumstances permitted. I think about that when people talk about what family means. I think it means more than presence. It means the sustained effort to do what you can with what you have, for the people you love, even when the circumstances are not what anyone would have chosen. My name is Graham Whitfield, and I am the son of Warren Whitfield. Patient man, quiet builder, and father in the only way he was allowed. That is enough. More than enough. It is, in fact, everything.